Good afternoon, everyone. I'm calling to order this hearing of the Committee on Indian Affairs. Thank you for the opportunity to gather here in Unalaska. It's always an adventure coming to Unalaska. Unalaska is in itself an extraordinary and a beautiful place, a beautiful land with extraordinary people, and so we are pleased to be with the people. But it is not without its challenges, and I think part of that challenge is just the travel. And many of us at the dais here today experienced a little bit of that challenge. Many of you in the audience today either experienced that today or you do on other occasions as well. I think we recognize that travel here is a little bit different than anywhere else in the country. Many of our communities are remote, and some of them are extremely remote. We're not connected by roads. We're not connected by much of anything else, and so it's planes and boats that bring us together, and it's not without cost. The cost of an airplane ticket to get out here is attention getting, close to $1,000 one way to move you and your family. That's a problem. When you have multiple cancellations and the airport packed with people trying to come and trying to go, that's a problem. And so when it comes to planning a hearing like this, I think it requires a fair amount of flexibility. So we thank those who have been flexible with us. I hope that for those who have traveled here, you have gained some small sense of what the people who live here experience every day, all throughout the year. Thank you to our federal witnesses in particular for sticking with this trip. I hope that now that you are in Unalaska, you can see that it is worth it. It's not only worth it to be on the ground and to see for yourself, but to kind of connect and understand a little bit more with what the people who live here, who call this amazing place home, what they accept as the day-to-day challenge of living in a place like Unalaska. Before we start, I want to pause and acknowledge that we are present on the traditional homelands of the native Unagan people who have lived on the island of Unalaska for thousands of years. And it's these lands that the federal government forced the Unagan to relinquish, in many cases allowed the military to use them, and then in later settlement of Aboriginal land claims, they conveyed them, and they conveyed them many times with contamination to the Alaska Native corporations that Congress had created. And it is that injustice and the decades-long breach of the federal government's trust responsibility that really brings us here today. So a few housekeeping matters this morning, or now this afternoon. This is an official United States Senate hearing, and as such, the format will be the same as the format that we use for our hearings in Washington, D.C. So I will take testimony from our 6 invited witnesses, and then I will proceed to ask them questions after the hearing is over. Anyone is welcome to submit their own written testimony, so I include those of you here. You can submit that testimony to the committee. It will be made part of that hearing record, and that record will be kept open for 2 weeks. Anyone who wants to send testimony should send it to testimony@indian.senate.gov, and I'll repeat that at the end of the hearing here. I want to extend a special thank you to the community of Unalaska for hosting us. I want to thank the city, the tribe, the village corporation staff for working with all of my team to pull together both this hearing as well as the field site tour. So this hearing is entitled Contaminated Land Conveyances, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, the Detrimental Impacts of Contamination on Native Communities, and Next Steps for Environmental Justice. It is an opportunity for us to examine the unique history and legacy of Anxia, including the conveyance of contaminated lands. It will allow us to reflect on the progress made to inventory and to clean up a few of those sites, along with understanding the progress that has not been made. And it's also a moment to determine really what comes next. What all of us, from Alaska Native tribes, ANCs, and tribal consortia to the state of Alaska and our federal agencies, all of us working together to remedy this urgent problem. And I will just underscore what we will hear from one of our witnesses later. Another report is not a remedy to this ongoing injustice. I think the people are looking for an actionable plan. To me, what we're discussing today is really environmental injustice, true environmental injustice. We're talking about lands that the federal government conveyed to Alaska Native corporations to settle Aboriginal land claims that were often horribly contaminated, even in some areas that many would consider or expect to be pristine when you simply look at the place. There are hundreds of known sites with contamination across Alaska. More than 500 of them are classified as formerly used defense sites. And that means that their contamination was caused by past military activities, and the Department of Defense is responsible for cleaning them up. Many of these sites are on Alaska Native lands, including those transferred under Anxia. Some of them are here on Unalaska Island, where we are today. We will hear testimony from the mayor. There's 51 areas of concern impacting approximately 80,000 acres here on Unalaska Island. We will have a chance to see a FUD site later today. At that point, we will learn more about the trilateral agreement between Unalaska Corporation, the, I always say this wrong, Kawalingan tribe of Unalaska. Sometimes I just say the Q tribe. The city of Unalaska, but also the work of the Local Resource Advisory Board and the collaboration between the federal government, led by the Army Corps and the state of Alaska. So this is, as I mentioned, an injustice, an environmental injustice, but I think it's also a crisis. The contamination on native lands across Alaska is contributing to very real and, in many instances, truly awful health impacts, including clusters of cancer and Parkinson's, from activities as simple as harvesting and eating berries. Traditional hunting and fishing grounds have been affected, threatening food safety, food security, and native culture, which is tied to the lands and the waters. The impacts are only getting worse as erosion exposes chemicals and waste that have been buried for decades. And yet, there doesn't seem to be the sense of urgency that I think is the imperative here. This is a responsibility. This is an obligation of the federal government to basically clean up its own mess, and there's no urgency that we're seeing. If these had been private entities that had left this level of contamination, believe me, the attitude and the urgency to address it would be entirely different. To me, that's shameful. It's the type of thing that makes Alaskans lose faith in our government, and it continues to harm innocent lives, families, and communities. As the Indigenous people here know, this is not the first time the federal government's lack of coordination and poor decisions have led to human tragedy in this region. During World War II, the United States government interned the Anagan people to squalid relocation camps in southeast Alaska, while their non-native neighbors were allowed to stay. Nearly 10% of internees died at the camps, and those who were allowed to return found their homes compromised by contamination. We also cannot forget the especially tragic wartime experience of the residents of the village of Attu, who were taken by the Japanese and held as prisoners in Japan until the end of the war. About half of them died. The survivors were never allowed back to Attu. The entire village was lost. More than half a century later, these World War II impacts are still very real for the people who live there. I have tried to make headway at the federal level. Been working on this matter for years, working with many of you that are sitting around this dais here. But progress has been slow. It's been difficult. We now have inventories of Anxia-contaminated sites and reports full of recommendations, including funding and land exchanges. We also had to change the law to address liability concerns because up until 2018, ANCs were considered potentially responsible parties for the contamination on the lands that the Bureau of Land Management had conveyed to them. These were lands that were contaminated by the government. BLM conveys them and then says that the liability is to the ANCs. You just can't make this stuff up. So we're here today to shine a spotlight on these issues yet again. We're asking for help. We're asking for leadership from the executive branch. And yet it seems we still have more people interested in avoiding blame than taking responsibility. So I think we have to acknowledge a few of the recent bright spots, including EPA's grant program focused on Anxia-contaminated lands. But even with that progress, cold, hard fact still remains. And that is that at the current rate of funding, the remediation and cleanup of these lands will take decades, if not centuries. And that will mean needless human suffering and environmental devastation in the meantime. And that can't be acceptable for any of us. The time to act is now, and this hearing is designed to move us further along that path. So I have taken more time with an opening statement than I usually care to do, but I think it's important to set the table for the dialogue. We've got a great panel of witnesses that have traveled with us to be here today. We're going to lead off today's panel with Mr. Steve Cohn. Steve is the Alaska State Director for the Bureau of Land Management for the Department of the Interior. He's based in Anchorage. He's accompanied by Erica Reed, who is the Acting Associate State Director for BLM at the Department of the Interior. Next to Ms. Reed is Mr. Carlton Waterhouse. Mr. Waterhouse is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Land and Emergency Management at the EPA, based in Washington, D.C. We welcome you. We have Laura Beasley, who is with the Chief Environmental Division at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, also in Washington, D.C. Thank you for traveling so far. And she is accompanied by Colonel Damon De La Rosa. Colonel De La Rosa is known to many of us around the state. He is the Commander, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the Alaska District and has been working on many, many projects around the state. We know you're a busy man, so thank you for being here. The Commissioner of the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, the Honorable Jason Bruni, is with us here this afternoon. Jason bases in Juneau and Anchorage and usually on Alaska Airlines, where we see one another quite frequently. But thank you for making the trip. Of course, our local leader, the Honorable Vincent Tutiakov, who is the mayor here of City of Unalaska. He's also the chairman of the board of the Unalaska Corporation. He's the traditional chief of the no, I'm not doing it right. The QT. Thank you. But as mayor, I also call him my friend Vince, and I appreciate your leadership over the years. And to round out our panel today is a woman who has been leading on these issues of environmental contamination on Anxia lands for years now. Holly Bissett is the Executive Director of the Alaska Native Village Corporation Association, and she has just been a dynamo on these issues. And so, Holly, we're very, very grateful that you are able to be with us today. So each of our witnesses has been told that they have about 5 minutes to deliver their testimony orally. We'd ask that you try to summarize, if you will. Your full written testimony will be made part of the official hearing record. And so know that that will be fully incorporated but we do hope that we have an opportunity for more questions at the end. So if you can keep your statements much shorter than mine, we're going to do just fine. So with that, I will turn to you, Mr. Cohn, with the Bureau of Land Management, if you would like to start the discussion. Thank you.
Vice Chairman Murkowski, I am Stephen Cohn, Alaska State Director at the Bureau of Land Management. I'm also accompanied by Erica Reed, Acting Associate State Director for BLM Alaska. We are pleased to be here to provide testimony regarding contaminated sites conveyed out of federal ownership to Alaska Native corporations through the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, or Anxia. Indigenous communities, communities of color, rural communities, low-income families, and people in the U.S. territories have long suffered disproportionate and cumulative harm from the climate crisis and air and water pollution. Alaska Natives have been especially burdened with contaminated sites on former federal lands and facilities conveyed through Anxia. The Department of the Interior and the BLM understand the health, safety, and environmental concerns associated with these actions. We are committed to working with our agency colleagues to chart a productive path forward. The passage of Anxia entitled Alaska Native Communities to select and receive title to 46 million acres of federal land. Since enactment, over 44 million acres have been conveyed. As the Secretary of the Interior's designated survey and land transfer agent, the BLM is responsible for adjudicating land claims, conducting and finalizing cadastral land surveys, and transferring legal title of federal lands. Under Anxia, the BLM does not have discretion about whether to transfer the lands once they are selected. Over time, it has become clear that some of the land conveyed under Anxia included contaminated sites from former federal facilities. Initial recognition of the growing issue led to the chartering of a Statement of Cooperation group in the 1990s by various federal and state agencies, which began the first collaborative efforts to address contaminated sites. To further understand the scope and scale of the issue, in 2016, the BLM provided Congress with a report which summarized progress made through a collaborative effort to develop an inventory of potentially contaminated sites conveyed, known as the Contaminated Lands Inventory, or CLI. The CLI represented the first and only comprehensive geospatial inventory of potentially contaminated sites. Earlier this year, the BLM began to incorporate a new database provided by the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation into the CLI. Once the BLM completes assessment of the state's database, the BLM expects more detailed information will be available to facilitate future action on these sites. The 2016 report to Congress further recommended the establishment of a formal working group, which resulted in the creation of the Anxia Contaminated Sites Working Group. The group includes the Department, the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, and the EPA. Additionally, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium's Contamination Support Program helped establish and continues to facilitate the Anxia Contaminated Lands Partnership Group. These efforts provide an ongoing forum to share information and create a strategic plan for cleaning up and restoring contaminated sites using the combined resources and capacities of the member agencies and organizations. The administration recently initiated the Arctic Executive Steering Committee to focus on an action-based approach to prioritize the Anxia contaminated site issue. This interagency group has a strengthened commitment to establish a strategy that leverages federal agency authorities through 4 primary goals. These goals include strengthening communication and effective collaboration between federal agencies, the state of Alaska, Alaska Native tribes, and Alaska Native corporations, and determining what additional assessment and verification is needed to determine the scope of contamination at sites. It also includes identifying eligibility and prioritization requirements for cleanup and contaminated sites, and most importantly, initiating cleanup. The Arctic Executive Steering Committee will complement the existing Statement of Cooperation interagency collaboration by establishing a federal strategy that will successfully complete critical milestones, resulting in the cleanup of sites statewide. While the BLM's authorities under Anxia are limited to processing those actions involved in transferring land ownership, the BLM has adapted its adjudication procedures for future conveyances of land to Alaska Native corporations to add steps for providing notice of contamination identified through existing database review. The Department of the Interior and the BLM support the President's call to action to address current and historic environmental injustices and ensure accountability. We are committed to doing our part to address this important issue here in Alaska. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tom. Let's next turn to Dr. Orr.
Thank you so much, Senator. Good morning, Senator Murkowski. I am Carlton Waterhouse, Deputy Assistant Administrator for the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Land and Emergency Management. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Cleaning up Anxia sites is important, and I'm grateful to be here with my federal colleagues to discuss how we can collaborate to produce greater results for the people of Alaska. As a former resident, Alaska and its people are near and dear to my heart. The issues here are unique and require creative and thoughtful solutions. I recognize that Anxia lands present unique challenges: remote locations, limited transportation, equipment availability, climate change, and the vastness of the state make cleanup efforts more challenging. I'm excited to discuss how EPA is working to lead an effort to bring the federal family together to take on those challenges and move forward with greater urgency to address the legacy contamination on Anxia lands. We're actively working with our federal and state partners to develop a robust framework to achieve faster cleanups. Informed decision-making, effective coordination, accountability, and commitment to using a whole-of-government approach are critical to our success. Today, I join my colleagues across the Biden-Harris administration in a partnership to prioritize addressing the contaminated threats that overburden Native villages and tribes, and to achieve our goal of a cleaner, healthier, and more equitable nation for all people. Alaska Natives have long been impacted by contamination where they eat, work, and play. Here on Alaska, we know that federal operations in the last century left a legacy of contamination, including PCBs, heavy metals, and asbestos. The independent approaches used in the past have not been effective enough. In partnership with ADEC, EPA is currently using our available authorities, including our Superfund, brownfield, and underground storage tank program, to address contaminated Anxia lands. We will continue to evaluate our authorities to expand our efforts. While EPA's authorities under CERCLA might be most useful as a tool for orphan sites, EPA has additional authorities for land-related cleanups and can also provide technical expertise and leadership. Recently, EPA Region 10 expanded its existing CERCLA cooperative agreement with ADEC with a specific focus on Anxia work, including site inventory and preliminary assessments. This builds on EPA's previous work to evaluate sites for CERCLA cleanup. In June 2022, I joined senior federal officials with the White House Arctic Executive Steering Committee to launch a collaborative initiative across the federal family to leverage collective resources and expedite progress to clean up contaminated sites in service to this administration's commitment to addressing environmental justice. I'm co-leading the Anxia Contaminated Lands Initiative in partnership with DOI and DOD with the support of DOE, NOAA, and others. The initiative strengthens collaboration between the federal government, our state, tribal, and local partners to improve the process to clean up those contaminated sites that have not been addressed. We're working together to identify how best to leverage our agency's available authorities and tools to enhance this effort. The initiative has four main components: enhanced collaboration between federal, state, Alaska Native tribes, and Alaska Native corporations. 2, a focus on data assessment and verification to develop inventory and identify scope of contamination. 3, identification of eligibility and prioritization of cleanup sites. And 4, an effort to move forward with assessments and cleanup activities based on the information gathered. EPA stands ready to assist ADEC in developing and managing an enhanced site inventory, which is a critical first step under a pending Memorandum of Understanding. Further, EPA appreciates proposals that will support any activities that further the work to address Anxia sites and ensure that our tribal partners are engaged and involved. In the coming months, EPA will continue working in this effort to improve the quality and pace of addressing Anxia-contaminated lands. We look forward to engaging directly with our Alaska Native partners most affected by the legacy contamination to advance cleanup efforts and produce faster and greater results. EPA recognizes that Alaskan Natives have waited too long for a solution, and it's now time for us to act. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Waterhouse, excuse me. Next, let's turn to Lara Beasley.
Vice Chairman Murkowski, I am Lara Beasley, Environmental Division Chief for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to address the Corps' activities on behalf of the Department of Defense in cleaning up contaminated lands that were transferred under Anxia. The Corps supports the DoD's commitment to protecting our environment and preserving resources for future generations. Throughout our nation's history, the DoD has used lands across the United States. When this land was no longer needed for these activities, the DoD cleaned up the land using the best available practices and returned the land to private or public use. Today, the DoD continues the environmental cleanup of its current and former lands. The Corps executes 2 programs on behalf of the DoD to clean up hazardous substances, pollutants, contaminants, including military munitions, and debris that were the result of DoD activities on Alaska Native lands. These programs are the Native American Lands Environmental Mitigation Program, referred to as NALEM, and the formerly used Defense Sites or FUDS program. In recognition of the Federal Tribal Trust responsibility, NALEM specifically focuses on the effects of past DoD activities on traditional ways of life. This includes the ability of tribes to safely conduct activities for subsistence or to access sites for cultural or religious purposes. Under NALEM, funds are provided to participating federally recognized tribes under cooperative agreements to carry out environmental mitigation projects that are proposed and prioritized by the tribes. Since 1993, the DoD has invested over $100 million in the cooperative agreements with Alaska Native tribes, including $30 million in the last 5 years, the highest funding commitment to a single state. The scope and magnitude of the FUDS program in Alaska is significant. FUDS are properties that were formerly owned by, leased to, or otherwise possessed by the United States and under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Defense. Alaska has the greatest number of eligible FUDS in the country, with more than 500 properties. Many of these properties are on Alaska Native lands, including lands transferred under Anxia. Since 1984, the DoD has invested over $1 billion in cleanup of FUDS in Alaska. This includes over $200 million over the last 5 years, more funding than any other state in the country. In fiscal year 2022, the Corps plans to execute approximately 15% of the FUDS appropriation on sites in Alaska. Senator Murkowski, Colonel Damon De La Rosa, Commander and District Engineer of our Alaska District, has prepared oral testimony as well to share local examples of how the Corps is supporting DoD's commitment to protecting our environment and restoring sites contaminated by past military activities on Anxia lands.
Colonel De La Rosa.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, Senator Murkowski and distinguished members of the committee. I am Colonel Damon De La Rosa. The Alaska District is very busy right now, largely in part to your efforts, ma'am, so thank you. I'd also like to say thank you to the Nungan people who respectfully acknowledge you as the original people of this land. And we are grateful to be specifically discussing your ancestral homeland and are thankful that you have welcomed us among you today. Thank you, Senator, for our opportunity to discuss contaminated Anxia lands. The Alaska District provides critical support, executing a significant amount of work for the FUDS and NALEM programs within the state of Alaska, as you heard Ms. Beasley say. The success of the FUDS and NALEM programs is a credit to the extraordinary individuals at the staff level and the interagency cooperation in Alaska. The Corps values these partnerships that improve consultation, communication, coordination, and cooperation. Through a charter partnership of the state and federal agencies in Alaska known as the Statement of Cooperation, and through the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, the Corps is working side by side with numerous federal and state agencies, the tribes, Alaska Native corporations, and others to foster collaborative approach and leverage our collective resources to expedite progress to clean up Anxia-contaminated lands. These partnerships include EPA, DOI, DOE, NOAA, the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, and others. I have an Unalaska cleanup example to share with you at the site known as the Naknek Floods Unalaska Valley. The Department of Defense's use of a Naknek Island and Unalaska Island was expansive. After the June 1942 Japanese bombing of Naknek, the Army moved to disperse its housing on Unalaska Island to areas such as Unalaska Valley. Following the passage of Anxia, the Aleut Corporation obtained subsurface rights, and the Unalaska Corporation obtained surface ownership in this area. The Corps has already conducted extensive cleanup on Unalaska over the last 40 years. However, in 2019, the community expressed overwhelming support to form a Restoration Advisory Board, or RAB. The RAB, consisting of many of Unalaska's community leaders, has helped develop the priorities for continued cleanup. Several cleanup efforts are underway by Unalaska Corporation Environmental Services. So, Senator Murkowski, in closing, we sincerely thank the committee for this opportunity to discuss the Corps' environmental cleanup activities on Anxia-contaminated lands and our support for collaboration. The Department of Defense has made significant progress cleaning up Anxia lands, and we will continue to advance these efforts.
Thank you, Colonel. Let's go to Commissioner Bruni, please.
Thank you, Senator Murkowski, and I so appreciate the champion you've been for this issue over the years. You have long acknowledged that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with, and I'm very grateful for your leadership on that. But we've heard a lot of talk today. We've heard a lot of talk over the last few years. Actions speak louder than words. In 1990, again in 1995, and once more in 2014, Congress instructed the BLM to address this issue. Congress recognized that Alaska Natives did in fact receive contaminated land. Again, Congress instructed the BLM to investigate these sites, prepare cleanup plans for every contaminated site with express timelines to do so. And then they were to ultimately clean them up. In the 2016 report to Congress, they passed the buck onto DEC with no funding to do this. As Senator Murkowski said in her opening comments, if this was any other responsible party, they would be the ones on the hook for doing this. The state of Alaska has repeatedly requested the Bureau of Land Management to follow through with Congress's directions. To date, the BLM has ignored these directives. They've prepared skeletal reports, attempted to foist its duties onto the state, and ultimately, they've ignored the plight of the indigenous people, the Alaska Native people. When I worked for an Alaska Native corporation, I was the chair of the Anxia Resource Managers, which was the land managers for all of the regional corporations. The number one issue that we identified that needed to be addressed was Anxia-contaminated sites. We wrote letters then to President Obama. We followed it with letters to President Trump. To President Trump. I left in the middle of the Trump administration to take this position. I'm honored to work for Governor Dunleavy on this, and Governor Dunleavy was adamant that this was an issue we needed to address. He wrote a letter to President Biden himself. I wrote letters to, along with our AG, to the Department of Interior and to the Department of Defense and others. We actually were really excited that Secretary Holland, a Native American woman who grew up on the reservations in New Mexico in close proximity to contaminated lands, who recognized environmental justice issues need to be dealt with. We were so excited thinking that the department would finally do something. Instead, what we got was a letter in response to the governor's letter saying they are merely a real estate agent for the federal government and that they have, quote, no authority to do any of the things Congress has repeatedly directed BLM to do. We had an opportunity in Secretary Holland to practice what she was preaching, and this is what we received. It was very disappointing. So at the end of the day, ultimately, the state of Alaska had no choice. We had to bring litigation against the Department of the Interior, against the Bureau of Land Management. We did not want to bring litigation. We were hoping, and we've been trying to resolve this. And we all recognize this as an issue, but we ultimately, the force of litigation has ultimately brought us together. I want to point out something that, Senator, I'll make sure I include in the record, but 40 years ago or so, Tyonek Village Corporation received a letter from the U.S. government. It wasn't from the Department of Interior or the Bureau of Land Management. It was from the U.S. government. So it's not the BLM who denies responsibility. It's not the Department of Interior. Then who? It's the U.S. government. The village corporations don't know the difference, and nor should they. These contaminated lands, from a joint and several liability perspective, were contaminated when they were owned by the federal government. The federal government, from an environmental justice perspective alone, not to mention a legal perspective, has a responsibility to clean those lands up and clean them up expeditiously. What I've heard today is that things were put in place like the Statement of Cooperation. When Carlton Waterhouse was up here a few months ago, and I want to give huge kudos to the EPA, they have taken a leadership role on this, and I am proud to work with them on this. They are trying to address this issue, but they are not the landowners. But they are trying to convene through the Arctic Executive Steering Committee an effort to make this issue right. So thank you, Carlton, for doing that. However, when we talked about the SOC, no one from the Department of Interior had ever attended an SOC meeting. No one of them knew what had been discussed at the last meeting. Yet this is what we're relying on for the effort to try to clean these lands up. Actions speak louder than words, and we need action, not talk. I'm excited, and I have to give credit also to the Department of Defense. They have been a good actor. But at current levels of spending, it's going to take upwards of 200 to 250 years to get these lands cleaned up. That's not environmental justice. These things need to get cleaned up, and now. We do not need yet another broken promise to the indigenous people of our country. With that, I look forward to your questions, and I again appreciate your leadership on this, Senator.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mayor Sidigas.
Good afternoon, Senator Murkowski, agency leaders, and participants. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on such an important topic. My name is Vincent M. Tudikoff, Sr. I'm the Mayor of the City of Unalaska. I'm also Chairman of the Board of the Unalaska Corporation, the Village Corporation, formed under Anxia, and also I'm the traditional chief for the Cowlingan tribe. OC received 128,000 acres of land under Anxia in the Unalaska, Naknek, Unimak, and Sedenka Islands. I've lived in Unalaska for almost 75 years, and I've been to several of these areas in Alaska, in the Aleutian Islands, and also have seen the contamination in such villages as Nikolsky, Atka, Yatu, Shimia, Adak, St. Paul, Chinosky, and Fort Glenn on Umnak Island. Areas of concern that I've personally encountered. Growing up in Unalaska, we utilized buildings materials such as windows, doors, sidings, plumbing parts, and etc. But while retrieving necessary material to keep our homes weathered many of which were damaged by the military. Many of the people responded to the area of concern, such as asbestos, lead-based paint, covered material, PCBs in the ground, and in the storage buildings left by the military. This has been a cause for many of our people getting cancer, skin burns, loss of hair, and other sicknesses. Many of our people had died because of the contaminated watersheds. Fish have disappeared from most streams for years after the war. Within the last 25 years, some of those fish have returned. Birds have starved, been found on beaches across Unalaska and the Mackinac Island from eating contaminated food. Clam beds have been lost to contamination, and in some cases are the cause of death to the Aleut people. When OC is conducting a project and contamination is found, and the construction must stop, remediation must be completed before construction can again commence. Alternatively, if we clean our lands first, OC risks not being reimbursed. We are going through that now with APIA and the Head Start building. The OC Board, the Tribal Council, and the City of Unalaska have formed a trilateral group. The purpose is to bring personal concerns and plans for remediation of our lands on a Mackinac and Unalaska. We are a group identified by the World War II, and we look for the contamination on property owned by these entities. Recently, OC, the Cowalian Tribe, and City have been working together to not only identify and prioritize the contaminated sites, but also to move forward with the cleanup. Mitigation is important in order to address the physical and chemical impacts from past military activities to protect the health and safety of the entire community and allow for a safe practice of traditional cultural lifestyle. The U.S. Department of Defense created the first military outpost on the Mackinac Island in 1912. And in 1940, the U.S. Navy constructed Dutch Harbor Naval Operating Base. During the peak military activities of 1942 and 43, the Navy, Army, Marines had 65,000 personnel in the area, including all necessary infrastructure for troops such as housing, support buildings, power plants, defensive structures that were spread all across the island. By the late 1950s, the military largely abandoned Unalaska Dutch Harbor, leaving behind a great deal of history, along with over 100 contaminated sites and millions of dollars in remediation costs. Even more than 7 years after the military withdrew, OC and the tribe and the community continued to be negatively impacted. We were impacted by hazardous materials like lead-based paint, asbestos-containing materials, munitions, unexploded ordnance, unsafe buildings and structures, abandoned equipment, petroleum hydrocarbons from underground and abandoned storage tanks, Rommel stakes in the thousands. Only some have been removed over the past years. Persistent organic pollutants such as PCBs. Currently, we have known 51 areas of concern that range from size of impact from single underground storage tanks to full military bases. The city recently received a brownfield assessment grant, and OC is in the process of applying for one as well. There is no doubt that a number will increase significantly. Those impacted areas represent approximately 80,000 acres. The formerly used Defense Sites program under the Army Corps has been working on the island for over 30 years, and the Native American Lands Environmental Mitigation Program for 20 years. As we look to the future and have estimated at the present rate of mitigation, it will take more than 100 years to complete the necessary cleanup. The city, the tribe, and Unalaska Corporation have been collaborating to address these highest priority sites and have impacted and threatened community safety, health, and environmental based on what the limited availability of funding we have been able to secure. Each impacted area has adversely affected tribal and community economic, social, and cultural welfare, and limited full use of tribal lands and resources. The city, tribe, and Unalaska Corporation has dedicated to mitigation these impacts, to restore safe access to tribal lands and create a healthier and safer environment for the people, the community, and future generations. But the federal government needs to help us. We did not ask for lands to be contaminated. We did not, and we did ask them to clean them up. We received the land from the government already contaminated. We, the Unangan people of Unalaska and other Alaska Native groups, want to ensure that our Native corporations and tribal governments be involved in the cleanup of our land. We also want to prevent ancient burial sites and artifacts that have been disturbed or removed from our communities. Tribal sovereignty commands that the tribe and OC dictate such actions. So also to Senator Murkowski and other participants for coming to Unalaska and to hear our concerns. Thank you very much.
Ente, Shinanguninu, Naida. Hello. Thank you for being here, our friends, and especially the Honorable Senator Murkowski for your leadership on this issue. We appreciate the opportunity to testify here today in one of the most effective villages in our state. I want to point out, we started with the Pledge of Allegiance, and it just reminded me that, Alaska Native people historically have been some of the most patriotic in our whole entire country. In fact, we sign up for the armed services at a higher rate than any other ethnicity in the state, including non-Native people. And why is that? I mean, we fought, right alongside our fellow citizens, and the majority of the people that I talked to were just the most proud we could have ever been to become part of this great country that we call the United States. We were the last people in the United States to be allowed to vote. We at the time the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed, had been fighting for 100 years, which was way less time than anybody else in the indigenous community had to fight for their land. By the time that we signed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971, the federal government was no longer signing treaties with indigenous people. And instead, we had to settle for this kind of negotiated agreement. We did have the opportunity to have hindsight, though, and we knew that we did not want a paternalistic relationship with what we lovingly referred to as the Boss Indians around department. We wanted to own our land, fee simple title. So that was kind of the idea behind owning our land and being kind of the managers of our own destiny, right? Self-determination, that's what that's called. But it's important to realize that from 1867 to around the 60s, we were in a terrible era called the termination era, which is an area that is referred to as the kill the Indian, save the man. That's the type of thing that was going on. And unfortunately, Anxia actually contains a little bit of both the self-determination and the termination era in that document. We consider it a living document. We don't consider this issue resolved in any way, shape, or form. I'm just going to quickly tell you a little bit about the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, what's in it, and we're going to jump into contaminated lands and where we need to go. We ended up retaining right around 10% of what was 100% ours, privately owned for 10,000 plus years by the Alaska Native people in various locations around the state, country, if you want to, that's 44 million acres. In fact, we're probably arguably the largest landowners in the entire world collectively, because we got 44 million acres of land as a people, which is a big deal, right? It's important to point out that we only have 5 years to select those lands. Meanwhile, the state of Alaska, continues to have as long as they want to select whatever lands they want. And the gentleman started out by saying over 44 million acres has been transferred, but I'd like to point out that we have not received 100% of the Anxia lands. That has not happened, and it's been over 50 years. The timeline of contaminated lands, you start in the late 80s, early 90s. Alaska Native people started noticing that we were getting handed over contaminated sites. So the Alaska Federation of Natives, or AFN, led the issue to Congress, and they got this 1998 report. And in that report, they identified over 600 sites that needed to be cleaned up. They came up with these 6 really great recommendations, forming a working group, the cooperative agency agreements, and then plans to clean up the lands. There was about 6 different and really, really good suggestions on what ought to be done on this. ANBCA became involved in 2012 when one of our members said, whatever happened with this 1998 report? So we started asking. And in 2014, through the great work of the senators and our Alaska delegation, we were able to get Congress to direct the BLM and DOI to do another report. So that culminated in the 2016 report that you heard about today. And in that report, they identified over 1,100 sites that had contaminations on them that were Anxia lands. What it also basically said was that 1998 report was great, but we didn't do any of those things. So yes, there has been some cleanup. There has been some sites that have been closed out, but let me talk about those really quick, because many of the sites in those reports, if you read through the reports, in the 2016 report are referred to as Orphan Sites. And my understanding is they're changing that term now, but at the time of the 2016 report, an orphan site meant that that site was not currently in, and it had no plan to be in, any type of cleanup program. 90% of those sites were within 2 miles of a village, poisoning our drinking water and the food that we eat. In 2018, the Senator mentioned that the legal liabilities were lifted, and I just want to point out just really quickly, 1,100 sites. We estimate the cleanup cost of those sites to be between $60 and $100 billion, that's with a B. And up until 2018, we were actually legally liable to clean those up. So, excuse my language, but it was like, here's your crap sandwich, and now you're going to eat that. And so we're very grateful that the government was able to lift the legal liability. But since that time, since 2018, since 2016, have we seen an enormous amount of cleanups? Have we had any land swaps? Sir, you mentioned that ANTHC continues to have a working group that's meeting, and to my knowledge, that group has only met twice in 2018 and has had no meetings since then. We have heard stories of glow-in-the-dark fish, of lakes that are, the only lake up in Utqiagvik, there's a lake that was their only source of drinking water, completely contaminated. They cannot drink out of it, but they had been. They had been for decades before the United States government came out and started putting signs up there that says, don't drink this water. In that village and in Unalakleet, same thing. There was an Air Force base that was seeping jet fuel down into the water that everybody in the village was drinking. High rates of Parkinson's. If Unalakleet was here with us, they would tell you their entire family has died of that disease. This man was tested for a relationship between PCB consumption and Parkinson's because the health officials testing them knew or thought, and I looked it up, there's not any sign of the study I'm mentioning. He was never told if that was actually the case or not. that, they were testing them because they thought there was. But what I can tell you is we didn't have Parkinson's in Alaska Native villages before the last 100 years. So we know that there's a direct link between these things. We've heard stories of the military piling up tanks of whatever, barrels of whatever on frozen lakes, and then when they melt, they'll be gone. That problem will be gone. And that's not to point fingers at we didn't have the same kind of rules that we do now around waste and disposal that we had back then. But that's not to say that, in this very village, I think, the tribe wants to redo their subsistence. There's a stream that leads up to a lake here, and in that very lake is exactly what I'm talking about. The barrels of stuff that were piled up on the ice, and then you can't eat this fish. You can't walk your dog up there. There's asbestos and teeny little signs that say don't go in there, which is referred to as institutional controls, which is a high percentage of a lot of these closed-out sites. Institutional controls means we're just going to watch that area and make sure nobody goes in there. We'll put a sign up there, and hopefully nobody goes in there and drinks the water or eats the food, right? So I just want to point out, too, that, we're proud members and citizens of the United States. And under the United States Constitution, the Fifth Amendment says that you cannot take private property for the public without just compensation. Well, I just explained to you what people ask me all the time, what's the percentage? According to a recent lawsuit filed by the state of Alaska, 17.6 million acres were transferred, at least partially contaminated, to our people. Now, some of the village corporations might recognize that number because that's about the size of the land that we've received so far, 17 million acres. That's 40% of the land that we retained, which was less than 10% of our state. And I'd like to know what percentage of the federal government's land is contaminated or Alaska's land is contaminated. We have heard time and again when we ask for different land or for cleanups, the solution has always been, what we should do is we'll do an inventory of the land that's out there, and we're going to make a plan, right? And we're going to do this interagency cooperative thing. And it's just frustrating, and it's not that we don't appreciate it. We do. We appreciate the action around this, but putting another report out there for us to say, yep, we did it, isn't good enough. We need actions. We need actual cleanups. You cannot give in exchange for let's just talk about the money here for a minute, and we're really proud of Anxia, okay? We were able to hang on to what we could, and in the past 50 years, we've shared about $3 billion in resource revenue. The Alaska Native corporations are the highest generating, we're a quarter of the GDP right now. We bring in about $16 billion a year into the state of Alaska. We reverse the economic model. We go outside the state, we bring the money back home. But in that same period of time, the state of Alaska and the federal government, I imagine, have collected over $200 billion in mineral and resource extraction monies. And we got a $60 to $100 billion contamination liability. Does that sound like a good deal? I know that none of you were here when this happened, and I'm asking you, because now that we are aware that this happened, I'm just asking that we do something more meaningful than putting fences around it and saying don't go in there. We were promised self-determination to get lands that were of economic value. Let's talk about that real quickly, and then I'll stop. In the past 50 years, if we haven't been able to develop or have these lands, or if we're having to remediate everything that we dig up for a daycare or whatever it is we're trying to do, that's the cost to us. How many economic losses do you think that there have been over the last 50 years? Buckskin Beach, where you're going in Kodiak, that site was specifically selected so that the village could have a port or a harbor. 50 years of no harbor fees or dock fees to collect. What does that look like? So again, thank you for inviting us here, and I know I'm passionate about this issue. I'm grateful for the increase in NALEMP funding, which they mentioned was up to $30 million. $30 million, though, for the entire United States. This administration in particular, it's been frustrating. Commissioner Bruni mentioned that they've completely we're not responsible at all, which is a very different thing when they're trying to lead environmental justice. This is easily the largest environmental justice in our state. And we still have not seen anything but, some more reports. And we are grateful that there's currently some money being set aside in the appropriations bill. We hope we can hang on to that. But $30 million split 500 ways in Indian country is not going to get us there. The recent Anxia bill established a tribal super fund that completely left Alaska out. And we can work with tribe or village corporations no matter how it's written, but this particular tribal superfund was written with a definition of tribal land that said under trust responsibility of the United States. And there are some of those, so that's basically Metlakatla in Alaska. There's one place that has that responsibility. And like I said, we chose this model because you will never meet a more hardworking person. And you guys, even if you're not native, you've been here 5-6 generations, know that you can't survive out here without being a hardworking individual. So we didn't want to be wards of the state. We wanted to work on our own economy. We are legally required to, and we proudly do, provide for the social, economic, and cultural responsibility of our people in perpetuity. We can't do that on contaminated lands. And so I would ask you to consider the land swaps that we have continuously brought to you. I mean, we need to have something that is actually meaningful, just compensation for the lands we gave up, which is 90% of our home. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Holly, thank you. So appreciate that and the passion with which you come to the debate. In listening, it seems almost obvious that we have a federal view to my left over here and the state and tribal and local view to my right. And so it wasn't intended to be that way, but perhaps for level of questions back and forth and the back and forth. And I would hope that there would be an opportunity for some of the issues that have been raised in both areas for people to be able to weigh in and to provide greater clarity for the record. So let's just begin with the questions here. And I think it is important to recognize that we're all talking about matters of environmental justice here. And I would hope that if there's any agreement up here, it is with a recognition that when our native peoples, our indigenous peoples, are provided or given a promise by the federal government that the very basic promise will be kept and that it will be fair. And I think we should just be able to stipulate that it is not fair that the lands that were provided to many of our Alaska Native people through the conveyance of Anxia, it is not a fair deal when the lands are tainted, when the lands are contaminated, when you cannot derive economic value as was promised. I want to start, I think I want to start with you, Mr. Cohen, because there's been a fair amount of back and forth here about the role of the Department of Interior and the reports that we've seen. You know, I think you can fully appreciate that when a report is asked for in 1998 and then 20 years later, you're still dealing with the fact that you just have a report and now we've asked for yet another updated report, and then we resolve the issue of liability in 2018, and then 5 years later we're here at a field hearing to discuss collaboration that from the perspective of those on the ground, another report is not the place where anybody wants to be. In 98, with that report, the Department of Interior did seem to recognize the environmental justice, that when you're conveying contaminated lands to settle land claims through Anxia, that this needs to be reconciled. And at that time, in that report, there was a commitment to take a leadership role to coordinate the implementation of the report's recommendations back then. So that was back in 98. Then in 2016, in the updated report, BLM takes a different view. And to the point that the commissioner raised, effectively saying BLM doesn't have a responsibility for any aspect of the contaminated lands problem. You've kind of reiterated that today here in your testimony, saying that, you know, basically your role is the transfer of land, and you have characterized the agency as the federal government's real estate agent, and basically placing any coordinating role with the state of Alaska, as well as EPA. That has been pointed out. EPA is not the landholder here. So I would ask if you would provide to me what you believe the responsibilities that the department and BLM specifically have to Alaska Native peoples with regards to the contaminated lands. Do you feel that you have no obligation other than what you have mentioned, that going forward you will provide notice if these lands are contaminated? Is there no obligation, effectively, with the agency itself as it relates to contaminated lands that were conveyed?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. And I will also, just speaking for myself, I do hear everything that's being said, and I really do. I do appreciate and understand the injustice that has happened, and want to recognize that. And I do think, you know, it is a situation that has developed literally over decades, and so I understand the frustration and the length of time that this issue continues to be a problem for communities, for Alaska Native tribes and communities, and for the state as a whole. When Anxia was passed in 1971, it was prior to really the sort of modern environmental laws that really govern so much of what we're talking about today. And the role of the BLM in that act was fairly straightforward. It was really to act as the agent that would adjudicate land claims, survey those claims, and then eventually transfer title. And we have been doing that both with Alaska Native claims, as well as through Anxia, as well as with the state of Alaska through the Statehood Act, diligently for the last decades. And at that time, the statute was very clear that it's not a discretionary action for the BLM. Our role is to convey those lands pursuant to the Act. And at the time that the Act was passed, it did not contain a measure regarding evaluating those lands for contamination. And so I think it's, and as we know, many of those lands were selected in the 70s, and so they were done prior to really any acknowledgement or recognition of the scope of the problem.
So then, in 2014 then, with that congressional directive specific to BLM was effectively told, prepare a cleanup plan for each of the contaminated sites that were transferred pursuant to Anxia. So I get what you're saying about that period in between 1971 with the passage of Anxia and prior to this directive, but it seems to me that the language in 2014 was pretty clear. Now, that was not done. That was not included in the 2018 report. So you've got a clear directive, seems to me, to the agency to do this. We haven't seen that. Are you working to do that now?
Well, we have been working through following the recommendations in the report, in the 2016 report, with the primary initial step of really trying, for the first time, trying to have sort of a consolidation of all the information that we have from various sources, through the state, through the other federal agencies, and putting that information into a geospatial database. So actually not only having sort of written records or contemporaneous notes about these sites, but actually beginning to map them so that we have some sense of what we're dealing with. You know, and some of these different databases and different data sources, they don't all agree. They've approached the problems differently, and so we might have one database that describes one site and another database that might describe the same area with 10 sites. So we're trying to reconcile all that, and our intention is to finalize that with the most current data that we're receiving from the state, and then to transfer that, all of that information to the state as sort of a central clearinghouse for getting that information out.
So your plan is to bring together a more coherent inventory, and then give that to the state to fix? Because it seems to me that the directive to the BLM was to prepare a cleanup plan for each of the contaminated sites. So just transferring it to the state then doesn't seem to be a very fair plan for cleanup.
I appreciate the question, and I think our intention here is to provide this information to the state, given that the state has the authority to basically identify the responsible parties and to then work with those parties.
We've already identified the responsible parties. I mean, we've done that. That's what we began to do in 1998. That's what we saw with that second report in 2014 and in 2016. We are not still identifying responsible parties.
I would defer to the state on that question.
Are we still identifying responsible parties? Or are we pointing fingers?
Senator Murkowski.
You turned it off, yes.
I'm sorry. Senator Murkowski, through joint and several liability, the federal government is a responsible party. Full stop. There are definitely other responsible parties, but the federal government, who was a landowner during the time that contamination occurred, is a responsible party. I don't know if that's Department of Defense, if it's the Bureau of Land Management, if it's the FAA, or who it is, Senator, but it's the U.S. government. And it is the responsibility, I would hope, of someone in the federal government to stop pointing fingers, to stop saying it's the responsibility of a different federal agency other than themselves, and to put a plan together, as instructed by Congress, to clean up these lands. The responsible party, full stop, is the federal government, and the indigenous people, the Alaska Native people, have an expectation that the federal government will work out who the responsible party is amongst themselves, or who may have contaminated the lands when they were in the ownership of the federal government, and then they can go after them. But through joint and several liability, Senator, the United States government is the responsible party.
So what we've been asking for some period of time is really to have that entity, that federal entity, that is the coordinating agency. And I know nobody wants it. Everybody wants somebody else to take this on. But it seems to me that the Department of Interior, that BLM, is probably in the best position to act as coordinating agency to help to coordinate all of this, to speed this up, to do exactly what the Commissioner has just outlined. If there is an issue about whether the contamination was caused by military or by another federal agency, to figure out how we prioritize additional funding, to pay for the cleanup, to provide land exchanges, as Holly has suggested, to take back the damaged lands, to allow the corporations to gain different lands, useful lands, that will again address this longstanding issue. It seems to me that that should be one of the outcomes from what happens today, is that at a bare minimum here, we get some commitment. And I would hope that the Department of Interior and you as the new BLM State Director would be willing to make that commitment, step up, and take on the coordinating agency role here with respect to Anxia-contaminated lands. We have got to stop saying that we're going to come together, we're going to collaborate, we're going to create these task force, these interagency working groups. I'm all over the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, but again, this is not an issue that we need to study and study and study. What we need to do is we need to have an actionable plan. And so I would ask if you can commit to me today that the Department of Interior, through BLM here in the state, can take on this coordinating role.
Senator, I can certainly take that request back to the department.
Ms. Reed, can you speak to that?
I think I would have to echo Steve's comment that we'll take that request back to the department, but we are committed to working with our federal partners to correct this injustice.
Well, know that I have already asked Secretary Holland on this specific issue, have raised this issue with her when she was before the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. I don't believe that I've raised it at an Indian Affairs Committee, but have suggested that if it is Interior, the Department of Interior, that would play a very key and a very important role in terms of a coordinating agency. So I would like to know that by the end of this, I don't even know what day this is, this is Tuesday, by the end of this week, we can get some kind of a determination from Interior as to a commitment as a coordinating agency. Because for too long, we have had lots of eyes on things, but there's when nobody's really exercising the oversight, it's just too easy to not make forward progress, and I think that's where we have been with this issue. Everyone recognizes there's environmental justice that has been done. Everybody recognizes that this has not been just. Everyone recognizes that this is expensive. Nobody wants to take it out of their budgets. And this is where I'm going to turn to the EPA and bring you into the conversation, Dr. Waterhouse, because I want to echo what the Commissioner has said. I think EPA has been willing to be a partner with and working with us, certainly through the appropriations process, to figure out what more we can do to actually start the cleanup. And the cleanup is where we want to be. I don't want to be sitting here in another hearing to just talk about what more we need to be doing on an inventory side. I want to know actually what we've been doing to get these specific sites cleaned up. So let me ask you, Dr. Waterhouse, what does it mean to treat the Anxia-contaminated lands issue as an environmental justice issue? Is this something where, when we view it through this lens and a recognition that there are opportunities, I think, for resources, if we view these contaminated land sites as through the lens of environmental justice and being able to tap into different resources there. Talk to me for a moment about that.
Thank you so much for the question, Senator. For one, it means that we need to have an all-hands-on-deck approach. It means that we, not only as a federal family, need to reach across and beyond the silos that we've operated in the past, to be creative, to work with our state partners, to work with the tribal corporations, to work with the native villages, to work on this problem. But it also means we need to have an all-of-EPA approach. And so what we've done is look at the authorities that we have within our agency to bring together different funding streams that we can put together towards this problem. So it means that we are working within our Superfund program to make additional resources available for site assessment work. We're working within our Brownfields program to make additional resources available to get Brownfields funding and grants out to community members. We also are making more persons within the Office of Land and Emergency Management available to help to oversee this work. It means that we are working to prioritize this as something that we are dedicated and committed to seeing done and seeing it through. So for us, because environmental justice is a priority within the administration, we prioritize this work. That's why we've already made, past visits here and have other visits planned. And we have our staff in Region 10 who are working very diligently with us to help to oversee this work. And we're committed, Senator, to work with whatever resources Congress provides that supports the inventory, assessment, and cleanup of contaminated lands. And we plan on moving forward as quickly as we can. We agree with you that there's an urgency, and the urgency is part of our attention to the environmental injustice, which has been much too long going on.
So when you talk about a whole of government approach, agree. I've just asked that through BLM, through Interior, that they play a role as the coordinating lead. Do you think that is important to how we're able to execute a whole of government approach?
I think we absolutely have to have coordination to move forward. I think the problem of the past, Senator, is the fact that we've had multiple agencies working, but they're all working on their own tracks.
Right.
And we need to work together to be effective to get this done. With looking at cleanup work across the country, I'm going to be very candid with you, Senator, whether we're dealing with cleanup issues in New Mexico and in Arizona and Colorado and Utah with the Navajo Nation, or whether we're dealing with cleanup issues that are taking place in Alabama or in Michigan. I see similar problems when we have federal agencies that aren't really working together, and they're working across purposes. And I think even if DOI takes the lead as a coordinating agency, unless everybody is moving in the same direction, we still can find we're struggling with the same problem. That's why I believe that the Arctic Executive Steering Committee work moves beyond just saying, let's get a report out. But it means working together to get a unified database and dashboard that is shared between all the federal agencies and our partners on the ground in native corporations and villages, that is a public-facing tool that we all can use. It's not an end, but it's a necessary step forward, because right now we have different databases across different agencies, right? Sitting right here at this dais, we don't all agree on exactly where all the problems are. So until we get that, it's going to be hard for us to get solutions.
So let me ask on that. I think you've outlined the importance of making sure that you're consolidating the information, that everybody's not using different sources there. It kind of goes to what you were saying, Steve, about additional inventory. And yet you've got an imperative on this end of the table here. You've got people out here that probably had important things to do today, but they really care about the fact that their drinking water could be contaminated, that the berries, the salmon berries that are ripe now, or the blueberries that they're waiting for, might be contaminated. Nobody wants to hear that while we're doing additional consolidation of information and additional inventorying, that we're not going to be able to see action on the ground. As we do this, as we work to build out this coordinated dashboard, how does this mean that cleanup work is put on hold while we do all this?
Is that question for me, Senator?
Mm-hmm.
No, I think it absolutely can be the cleanup work. I think we have to, as my boss is fond of saying, we have to learn how to fly and kind of build a plane at the same time. So that's why we are really excited about the additional brownfields funding that's available. We're excited about the additional appropriations that have been kind of set up for work on the ground. That's why we're excited about using additional site assessment work to address orphan sites and moving forward as urgently as we can, while still moving this database that will be necessary for us to have prioritization. And I think, you know, one of the things is when you have a big problem, you got to figure out exactly what has to be done first. And so having the database allows us to then have a prioritization scheme to say, this is posing the greatest risk, we need to go there next. This site is posing a lower risk, but it's greater than the rest, we go there next. And I think those are essential steps that we have to move forward to be successful.
So let me ask you on the prioritization, because it is something that we hear a lot about. I think we recognize that the longer the floods are contaminated, the more we see the PCB pollution remain in the food chain, the more we see associated health problems. We're seeing increased instances of breast cancer amongst Alaska Native women, attributed to the PCBs from floods that we're seeing out in St. Lawrence Island. They think that other chronic illnesses could be attributed to them as well. And I understand that there's no direct research to support the claims that we're hearing out there. But again, we're hearing too many of these health-related concerns to not be paying attention to them. What active research programs do you have to better understand the health effects of the contamination that we know exists? And how then is that information being used to help prioritize the different sites for cleanup? How does that factor in? Yeah.
I'd say right now, because we have literally the DOD, it's got its important floods work that's going forward, its cleanup work. We have the BLM, which also has its own kind of footprint and approach to this within DOI. We have work that we're doing for assessment and work that we're doing for brownfields. To be honest, as of right now, we all have different work that's going on. We don't have a unified approach. So we're directing brownfields and other resources based on what we're hearing from people on the ground. So when people on the ground are telling us this is where there's a problem, this is where we're trying to say, well, let's see what we can do.
So you'll listen to the stories and the anecdotes. You don't necessarily wait and say, well, we want to have a study on that.
No, I don't think so, but we do, under our resources, we have to get scientists and engineers out there
Right.
to do sampling and to do investigation, and that's what we're doing on the Superfund program by making additional site assessment resources available, and we can inform the use of those resources by talking with our partners on the ground, the consortia, Native villages, and others.
And you're doing that in many of these visits that you're doing in the state, aren't you?
We are having a lot of public engagement, and we're trying to meet. And yesterday I was meeting with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, and these meetings are essential for us to know where we need to direct our resources.
So this is a question for anyone over here, Interior, Corps, or EPA. Does the federal government have an estimate on the cost to investigate and remediate the Anxia-contaminated sites? Holly has suggested in her testimony that it's somewhere between $60 and $100 billion is what is estimated. Can any of you speak to that estimated number and give me a gauge here?
And I think as you're looking at the DOD-specific areas, it's like obviously there's more contaminated Anxia lands than just what the DOD is looking at. We estimate it to be about $1.65 billion for the whole state of Alaska.
In Alaska,
For the state,
through
for
DOD.
the DOD funds program, yes, ma'am.
What about other lands that we have identified that are non-DOD?
Senator, I'll speak a little bit for what BLM has been doing. I mean, we have mostly, in terms of our cleanup work on the ground, been focused on sites that are, you could characterize them mostly as abandoned mines. They were mined previously by private entities. Those entities no longer exist or went bankrupt, left the state, and so we are working to clean up sites of that nature. And it's a limited number of them, and we have cleaned up several sites already around the state. Probably the largest single site that we're working on right now is the Red Devil mine in the Kuskokwim, which is, it depends on the final cleanup in terms of the final remediation, but the cost could range anywhere between $30 and $200 million for that one site. That's probably the largest single site that we're trying to address in the state.
But BLM has not more broadly identified costs of remediation throughout the state.
No, we haven't. We've only been focused primarily on the sites where we know that we're the responsible party for those sites, or potential responsible party, and again, mostly abandoned mine sites.
Commissioner, do you have a handle on what you believe remediation costs may be?
I think it's important to understand the extent of the problem. Many of these sites, as you outlined in your opening comments, are rural. Getting logistic support to rural Alaska is extremely expensive, Senator. To get some drill rigs out there, to actually understand, as BLM was instructed to do by Congress in 2014 and 2016, to actually to understand the extent of the problem, we got to get folks boots on the ground. So to make an estimate, Interior needs to do what they were instructed to do by Congress already. And so what Colonel De La Rosa was saying of $1.65 billion, that's what we know prior to the liability being removed. And I was with a regional corporation at the time. Folks were scared to say what they knew was contaminated because they might be responsible for it. So I think there's a lot more contaminated sites out there than we even know about. So that number that Hallie's leadership on this effort has been amazing, and she deserves huge credit. But I think the number is significant. I can't tell you what it is, but let me use Red Devil as an example. That $30 to $50 million cost, we had a mine project proponent in Donlin willing to clean that area up for mitigation, and the Corps of Engineers said no, and instructed them to lock up lands, and I was responsible for some of those agreements when I was at CIRI, to lock up lands for conservation, for mitigation for what Donlin is going to do, instead of cleaning up Red Devil and using their expertise. That's the part of thing that we should be considering as a win-win-win for the environment, for the watershed, and for project proponents who want to help areas. That's an opportunity where if the federal government is going to be not giving the money, you have the private sector willing to do it for mitigation. That's an opportunity. I think as we're talking about, we can't let a geospatial database or all that discussion get in the way of actually getting boots on the ground for doing site delineation, finding out the extent of the contamination, and actually doing the cleanup. They need to be parallel approaches. And we're not seeing that. The scale of the funding that we're seeing today is so minuscule, it's going to be decades. And I'll just conclude with an answer to that we don't know the number, but if truly Interior felt that this was a priority, they would do what they've done for the Ambler Road. They would do a brand new EIS on it, even though they don't need to, because that EIS and that ROD was already done. They would dedicate money that is being focused on fighting the state in navigability cases when we're trying to get rivers extended to us. They would use that money. Nope, they're not finding that extra money because it's not a priority for them, Senator. And I guarantee you if they wanted to make it a priority, they would.
I don't disagree with you, my friend. And I want to get into this issue of, all right, we recognize that it's going to be costly to clean up. So what are some of the other proposals? And I think that there have been some suggestions here that I want to follow up with. But before I do that, I want to go over to the core for just a moment. I asked Dr. Carlton a little bit about the prioritization when you have health safety issues. Can you explain to me the prioritization that that DOD uses for FUDS cleanup? And we've got over 530 FUDS sites in the state, 196 are on Alaska Native lands, and 35 projects here on Alaska and 20 on Amaknak alone. So how does through DOD, how do you prioritize for FUDS cleanup?
Thank you, Senator, for the opportunity to explain that. As I've said, we have a significant issue with FUDS in Alaska as well as in the United States. So when we prioritize sites for investigation and cleanup, we follow a risk-based process. We address sites with the highest risk to human health and the environment first. We have two different ways of doing that, depending on the type of site. For sites that are contaminated with hazardous, toxic, and or radioactive waste, we use the relative risk site evaluation score. And every single site that has HCRW site in the FUDS program has a relative risk site evaluation score. For sites that are that have contamination from military munitions, we use the Military Munitions Response Site Prioritization Protocol, or MRSPP. Every single site in the FUDS inventory that has military munitions has been scored with the MRSPP. Those are not only scores that we do within the Corps of Engineers and the Department of Defense, but we work collaboratively on the data that generates that information with our stakeholders, property owners, and our regulators. The Corps also develops a statewide management action plan on a yearly basis with the state of Alaska, and our teams coordinate our cleanup activities with the state, EPA, and have meaningful involvement by our tribes, landowners, including Anxia, corporations, local officials, and the public. And then at the very local level, ma'am, we have the Restoration Advisory Board. And we're really proud of the very active Restoration Advisory Board here in Unalaska that meets quarterly.
Well, you mentioned the word coordination with other agencies, and I will just urge you to really be focused on that as you are working through the various cleanup sites. As most know, I have been very aggressive over the years in trying to get these legacy wells cleaned up on the North Slope, and I think we've made some progress, and that's good, but it's in the category of about damn time we've made some progress. But I have heard different stories about how we are not being as efficient as we should be across our federal agencies. It's expensive to mobilize equipment to get up to the North Slope for one season. And the equipment is relatively specialized. And what I hear is we'll send it up, it'll be up there for the period of time that it needs to be, and then it's sent back down, goes right across the area where the Department of Defense is working on another cleanup that needs the same equipment, but because one job is related to the legacy well and another one is a FUD site, we're not partnering as we might want to, even within our own federal agencies. The specifics that I'm talking about was a cleanup on Point Lay. This was some years ago. But it was just a reminder to me that we could be a lot smarter with how we are moving things around and how we are saving dollars on some of these cleanup projects. Are there issues with regards to permitting that can be approved? We're always talking about what we may want to do with NEPA exemptions to just facilitate more readily some of these projects. Is that something that would be important as you try to advance some of these projects on a more expedited timeline?
the challenges of having two people from the same organization over here. Who wants to send the news? Ma'am, obviously, I know when we talk about regulatory permitting, it's certainly a big topic. We've had a lot of conversations with both yourself and Commissioner Bruni on this topic itself. But the permitting and the NEPA piece with regards to getting into the FUDs cleanup, they're separate and distinct. So it's not impacting, changes to the NEPA process doesn't impact how we go about doing our FUDs cleanup.
Okay.
So maybe if I don't understand your question.
Well, I'm just, as we look at those things that we put in our way, those barriers to getting the job done, I want to know what the barriers are and if we can take some of those down. It sounds to me like you're saying that at least when it comes to NEPA, that's not an issue for you. Maybe there's other permitting issues.
No, ma'am, I really am proud of the work that we've done in the state of Alaska. It is, we are a continually improving organization, but we are getting work done. We are committed to continuing to clean up these sites. And we've spent more here than in any other state in the country.
Which we appreciate, but again, I think we recognize that when you're talking about $30 million over the last 5 years, I appreciate that it's the most for any other state, but we know we can go through $30 million awful quick moving stuff around this state. So I don't know, when you were walking me through the prioritization, if there's any way that you can prioritize Anxia lands within the FUD's selection process.
We certainly take all of our environmental justice requirements seriously when we do all of the scoring, whether it's relative risk site evaluation or MRSPP, and in our discussions with the state of Alaska in the statewide management action plan where we do our prioritization.
So then if we are recognizing that Anxia-contaminated land is an environmental justice issue, we're going to try to encourage the administration to commit to utilizing environmental justice funds. So if that's the case, can that not be incorporated as yet a one of the considerations for prioritization when you're looking at FUDs?
No, I think that's a great question, and I think it deserves a detailed response. Okay. But I would say I'd like to take that question back to the Department of Defense, as those prioritization protocols, those site evaluations are policy from the Department of Defense, and I think we deserve to give you a detailed response on that, Senator.
Well, I will await that response, and I would just encourage you to look at that critically. Again, when I think about the matters that we're referring to as environmental justice in the political world of Washington, D.C. today, I can't think of any example where there has been greater injustice done to our indigenous peoples than when it comes to our own government's failure to respond to our matters of contamination. So I would just ask you to take that back. I want to raise one very local issue here, and this came to my attention through the mayor. This is the site that the Q tribe raised. It's Building 551. It's a former Navy mess hall at the Dutch Harbor Naval Operating Base. It's located within the Mackinac and the Unalaska Islands FUDs, and it's a World War II era building with a former mess hall. And the building and apparently the lands are just full of PCB contamination. But this site was bombed by the Japanese. The site is not eligible for remediation under the FUDS program based on the high level of PCBs. And it was not eligible for work under the core, under the NALEMP program. But the tribe was actually told that this building can't be cleaned up under NALEMP because the impact at the site was caused by the Japanese bombing that superseded the DOD being there. Now, to me, this is one of those things that's like, wow. It's hard to fathom why the DOD would not be willing to work to address that. And so, as I understand it, and I'm looking to you, Mayor, for correction on this, but the burden, both financial and health-related, is now falling to the tribe and to Unalaska Corporation. And so you are undertaking that. It just seems to me that this is something that the Department of Defense should be willing to work with the tribe and the Native Corporation to address and fix this. And I want to make sure that I'm detailing this correctly, Vince. So it's my understanding that you are moving forward to address this because the Department of Defense will not. Is that correct?
Yes, and this is one of the issues that I just don't understand. I worked for BLM early on in the program in '72 when we were doing the land selections for the village on Alaska. One of the concerns we had then was contamination. This is one of the points that the specific building was hit by machine gun fire from a Japanese plane at the time. They were trying to bomb the building, missed it, and hit a contractor-based vessel that is now sitting in Captain's Bay, the Northwestern. And that was part of the damage that was done. I just don't understand, because I worked for Standard Oil for 20 years during that period. And, of course, they came back and said, well, Standard Oil, you're responsible because you were using that building for storage. But, you know, that was 30 years later. And yet the contamination was there. And it's proven. The city of Unalaska, I'll speak to it here, when they took over the power plant, which we're using now, we had to sue the federal government to clean it up. PCB tunnels that ran from that building, 552, to the transformer, to the power plant, were all traced to the military. We didn't put them in there. We don't have concrete batch plants. We don't have, equipment. In fact, we weren't allowed on Mackinac Island until late 1950s as residents of Unalaska. And if they caught us over there or chased us down, we were arrested by Shore Patrol. And a marshal would be called coming out of Coal Bay. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And I'm hearing some of these issues. It's just, my concern is that I would like to see the federal agencies get together and work, talk about it. It's like you have your own most of you, have your own building. You're afraid to go out and talk to the other one across the street. That's got to stop. Because this is a very important issue and has been. I appreciate the comments being made about, trying to get it done. But for me, and for probably many of the others that have been on OC board for many years, we're tired of it. Every time we get a letter back, we're going to confirm this, and we're going to start a study. Well, we've been studied enough. I think it's time to get the funding. Ask the Senator for more help there, but let's get these programs. Take all these studies and put them up on the shelf. They've been studied enough. Come out here. Send people out here. when you send out people to do work in the Aleutian Islands, you got to be ready and prepared. They do it in a short season, 4 to 5 months. So, and it's going to cost. So we need to get it done. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So I guess I'd ask you, Colonel De La Rosa, if you'll commit to work with me and with the tribe and the ANC to see if we can address this.
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, one thing I will say, I'm very, very proud of the RAB here in Alaska. I think the corporation, the leaders, the community leaders that are participating with that, my team from the Alaska District, they know them very well. They know them on a first-name basis. They see them regularly. I look out here and I see faces that know me, and I know them. And so I do hope you do understand that we do take this very seriously. We do get on the ground and we do talk to these folks. We do talk about the priorities, and I'm very familiar with this building. I know it's a contentious issue. Sometimes there are, unfortunately, things that get in the way, and I think we owe you probably a detailed response on this one. Acts of war, unfortunately, don't get covered underneath the FUDs, and it creates problems with regards to CERCLA, which is what we have to clean our FUDs project up to. So there are challenges within that. I recognize that there are contaminants underneath of this building, which in and of itself creates a problem. How do you clean up underneath of a building? You demolish the building, you clean everything underneath of it, so we don't build the building back. So there are competing challenges with this particular building, and I feel for the community, and we have this conversation, ma'am, and I feel like we commit to giving you a more detailed response on this particular one. This is not one that weighs lightly on us. We know that this is one of the biggest issues here. We'll owe you a better response.
Well, it's just kind of tough to recognize that it was here. It was here in the Aleutians where this country was invaded by the Japanese. Everybody else in the lower 48, when they think of World War II and how America was hit, it was Pearl Harbor. It was here. It was here. You had a whole village that was completely removed from their homeland. You had Alaska Native people, to Holly's point, who were standing watch, the Eskimo Scouts. This needs to be addressed. It just needs to be addressed. So I will accept your offer to have further background to it, but I think we owe it to these people here, not just Building 151, but so many of these other issues in terms of prioritization and what we can be doing to prioritize the cleanup on our native lands that have been transferred. Some of you have suggested, well, all of you, but BLM and EPA in particular, indicate that you've got existing statutory authorities that have some inherent limitations for work on Anxia-contaminated lands. If you've got limitations, part of what I can do as a lawmaker is we can work to change those. We can change the law. We can work to address some of these barriers. Do any of you have, for me right now, a list of the limitations that are kind of holding you back, or some proposed changes to the law that would help you better facilitate what we're trying to do here when it comes to remedying the situation with our Anxia-contaminated lands? And if you've got that quick list, I'm happy to take it now, but know that I would ask for more details on the specifics to this from the DOD, from the EPA, from the DOI. So would anyone care to comment on that at this point in time? Or you can all get back to me. All right. Well, I do see that as our EPA representative down there, you're nodding your head. I'm going to look for a list of proposed changes from you. Commissioner, were you going to weigh in on that? You got some suggestions?
I was just going to say, Senator, in the testimony that I submitted, there is a list of recommendations for potential statutory changes to Anxia as well as to CERCLA and RCRA that will help resolve many of the issues that we have.
Thank you for making the job easier for those of our federal partners. Holly?
Thank you, Senator. I just know we're closing out here, and I just wanted to address one thing. And first, Colonel, thank you so much for your service, all the hard work you do here in Alaska. I know you guys are working hard, all of you, to address this issue, and you're limited to your constraints. But $1.65 billion to clean up the entire state. I don't know, if I just took the example you used, $30 million to $200 million. We'll just do 30 for one site times 1,100, and I'm not like super good at math, but I think that's like $30 billion. So I don't know, how do you get from there to one? You know, it's just a matter of putting those fences up and saying, oh, these will never be cleaned, so let's just put that under institutional control. Those are orphans. We're just going to abandon those. And so I think the number is closer to what we don't know until we have this study, but I just wanted to kind of clarify that number for us.
So, Holly, I'd like to turn to you because you have raised the issue of exchange mitigation, both you and Commissioner Bruni. And I think we recognize that when it comes to land conveyances in this state, none of this is easy. I've worked with Sea Alaska Lands Conveyance for how many years? We're working the land lists now. Our Alaska Native veterans allotments, these continue to remain challenges. But I think we recognize that there are other ways to address the issue. You've noted some in your written testimony, and I think that those are appreciated. But as we look to what will come out of this hearing, this dashboard and this inventory that is perhaps better defined, but a plan for remediation and cleanup isn't enough unless we actually act on it. What additional follow-on would you specifically recommend?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. And I think first and foremost, when you take into consideration just the size and scale of what needs to be done to clean up these lands, and in this one village, that it'll take 150 years to get there, just in this one. And the 50 years past of lost economic opportunity. I mean, is it reparations? I don't know. I think it's land that's valuable, like I said. So this land swap to be able, I don't know, we want the land cleaned up too. So, but Commissioner Bruni actually was the first one to say, well, we think we ought to get 100 acres of land for every 1 acre we receive contaminated. Sounds like a good plan to me. And people in Congress will tell you it's really hard to get, lands in Alaska given over to private individuals. Well, that might be true, but it shouldn't be for Alaska Native people who are in this situation. This is maybe for a private industrial development company that's hard, but it shouldn't be hard for the people that gave up 90% of their country for, $60 billion or $30 billion, if we're going to be nice about it, worth of contaminated liability. There's also some creative solutions, Senator, that, again, Commissioner Rooney was the first to bring to us. And, this is around mitigation and cleanup. And I know it's hard to get some government funds to do stuff, but right now, if you're going to develop a project in Alaska, and I think it's everywhere in the country, but there's a 404 permit, and you have to purchase 2 acres of wetlands for every 1 acre that you impact. Well, that's expensive, right? But, we have to do what we have to do. However, what if instead of having to buy 2 acres of mitigation wetland credits, you were able to buy a cleanup credit, or you were able to actively clean up a site and get credit for that, and to restore the mine or whatever it was that was there to what it used to be, and you're still on kind of a net zero in terms of impacts to the environment. And I think that's a beautiful idea, the private industry. I mean, Donlin Mine is a great example, and Red Devil was brought up. They would have loved to clean Red Devil up and have that be their mitigation project. But that kind of law just doesn't exist. Well, we were nice and provided you some suggested language in our written testimony for you to consider, and I think that's a really creative solution. We understand that you don't have billions and billions of dollars to give out for cleanup, but we cannot sit around for the next 100 years continuing to lose on the lands we did receive and continue to think that we got a fair shot at this deal. So.
Well, and Mayor, that was one of the things that you had mentioned in your comments as well, is that the Unalaska Corporation would like to be more included in in cleanup aspects of it, recognizing that this builds capacity and provides for economic opportunity, cleaning up somebody else's mess, but you are able to provide for jobs here for your shareholders as well.
Yes, Senator, that was a point that we saw early on in the formation of the corporation, that we had contaminated lands. When we asked BLM for Department of Interior, BIA, whomever, they would tell us, hey, you selected it, it's your problem. Well, it took us back to the point, well, how are we going to do that without an economic base, which was not necessarily here then at the time. We didn't have fishing as we've seen for the last 40 years at the time. Yet we continue to move forward, work with the companies such as the cities, other partners in the industry, recognizing the fact that there may be that you do not dig to build from the ground up, cover it, will build from the ground up. I know as far as a company like Unalaska Environmental, which is an 8A company we formed because of necessity. We want to be able to clean our own lands, identify when we do run into soil movement, that we find sites where Anungan people have lived for thousands of years, these midden sites, that we be the ones to take care of that and bring these people to where we can understand the life that they had before we put them back into the ground again, which we do. But yes, we'd like to, and that's one of the reasons we formed AA, was to be the person, be the company. Now, in the past, we've had companies come in and not only companies, but museums in the late 40s and 50s through the 50s came in and dug up our lands, and we didn't know what they were doing, why they were here, and they would tell us, well, we're trying to find your culture and we'll get back to you. That didn't happen. A lot of that stuff would never return. The big part of our history is now sitting in some vault somewhere that nobody even knows about. So we want to prevent that for any future values that are interested in their culture. But yes, we want to be the companies that do the work on our land.
Well, and you've also mentioned that you have to take the initiative to resolve some of these lands. Otherwise, you can't make things happen within your own communities. And I think you mentioned a Head Start building here in Unalaska. Walk me through exactly what you're dealing with there. You obviously need to provide for your children in the community. I suppose you could wait until somebody prioritizes this as a cleanup project, but you haven't done that. You've attempted to move forward and address these issues yourself, but you're doing that at the city's own expense. Is that correct?
Yes, it's more of a working in partnership with with the tribe and APIA, which is a regional nonprofit that has put this facility in on behalf of the community. As we identified early on, if you don't have a daycare center or a place to take your children, a lot of workers cannot work. And so that's one of the reasons. But what happened was after they did a soil remediation test in the area of the building where the building was going to get built. While they were finished the foundation, they were putting in their access road, secondary access road. They went down into the gravel and hit the dirt and found fuel. It was an underground tank site. Immediately stopped all work, and rather than letting this building sit all summer without getting built, APIA and the corporation, I believe the city also to get the thing going, did the remediation, and now APIA is seeking additional funding to get that paid for. But we are, working with the APIA, the tribe, to try and, remediate this property. It's a small area. It's not even, I don't think it's more than, half an acre, quarter acre, if that, 200 by 100 feet or something like that. There's a stretch that was the underground tank. Identified later that there was a building there, and just unfortunate, nobody knew it was there. It wasn't on their radar. Nobody ever been up there before. But there's more sites like that on this island that we don't even know about. They've been identified 5,000-6,000 buildings, but where are the tanks? You have to dig to find them, drill to find them. It's unfortunate, but that's what we're dealing with here.
Let me ask you one more question, Commissioner, because the state's in a position where we get to a point where the level of cooperation and discussion is not yielding the action. And so the state has moved forward with litigation. That will proceed. That is clearly a tool that the state has. As a member of the federal delegation and as somebody on the Appropriations Committee, one of the tools that I've been working in my toolbox is trying to figure out, all right, can we work with the folks in EPA to stand up a separate program? We've got funding in this next fiscal year. We're starting out pretty skinny, but the fact that we've got a new program in is something that I'm encouraged by and think that we have some opportunities there. But I think we're all trying to figure out, all right, how do we move this in different ways, and whether it's at the tribal level, what the village corporations are doing, what the state is doing, what we're doing, and the agencies. So this is kind of a general question, but do you feel that the state has a fair working relationship with the federal agencies on this issue of contaminated lands? And if not, what more can we do to figure out how we're going to utilize this whole of government approach? Because when I think of whole of government, it can't just be the whole of federal government. It has to be all of government, at the state, the tribal, the federal. What more do we need to be doing?
If we thought the federal government was doing enough, we wouldn't have brought the lawsuit, Senator. I've talked with some folks off the record from the federal government that have said there's no way they're going to settle this case that we've brought, which is disturbing to me. What we need is commitment. We need legally defensible commitments from the federal government, a compliance order by consent that will make commitments that they are going to advocate for funding and they are going to put a timeline for the cleanup of these sites. We also want to ensure that, and again, I need to give big credit to Carlton for the efforts with the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, but those groups come and go with administration. We saw that group do nothing for the preceding 4 years. So those efforts need to be codified. We also need to ensure that the plans that they're putting together, and when Carlton was up with folks a couple of months ago, we told them it is imperative that it's not just the federal government talking to themselves. They need to consult with the tribes. They need to consult with the regional corporations and the village corporations. They need to consult with the state. They need to use, as the mayor said, the regional and village corporations to do this work, the 8As. It would be a shame if they did not utilize those efforts. But we don't want to be told what they're going to be doing. They need to be consulting with us, with them, in developing the plan. But consultation cannot get in the way of cleanup. We could talk this one to death. We have for 50 years, Senator. We need to see action concurrently with consultation for these efforts. We need, and trust me, like I said, Senator, we did not want to bring this litigation, but we had to. And the only way we won't go forward with this is if we see an agreement that will be followed, that will be adhered to. We've already seen broken promises or federal law ignored. 2016, you, Senator, along with the rest of your colleagues, got at least to 51 votes in the Senate and whatever number in the House. You passed law that said the Department of Interior, BLM, shall develop plans, and they ignored it. So I don't know what else you can do. There's got to be something that is enforceable to ensure that the federal government just doesn't put this energy today for the next 2 years, and then in 2 years a new administration comes into play and ignores it again. We need commitment that is enforceable from the federal government to make this. And again, we need to make sure that the folks that are impacted are part of that process in developing the cleanup plans as well as the state.
So I have, in my notes that I've taken here, I have various actionable items that I've just kind of jotted down. But rather than me sharing with you what I think they are, I would like to hear each of our witnesses today give me what your takeaway from this hearing is and your actionable items as a follow-on, so that we all can kind of hear where the Department of Interior, the EPA, the Department of Defense, the state, the tribe, and our village corporations. I feel like, okay, this is what I'm doing, my agency is doing as we leave from here, because I don't want to have people who live here feel that was a nice 2.5 hours where people came together and talked about a really important issue, and it's just going to be more of the same. We cannot continue with more of the same, because more of the same is an injustice to these people and to Alaska Natives and people really all over our state and in our country. We've got an obligation on the federal side to clean up messes that have been created by our own government. And so how we keep that commitment for all the right reasons, environmental justice, health, safety, just doing the right thing, we need to do more than talk about it. We need to be able to act on it, and we need to be able to act on it now. So I'm going to begin with you, Steve, and we'll just go down the list as you were introduced in terms of your key takeaway and what you plan to report back to me, the committee, the Congress, and to one another.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The two takeaways that I have in my notes, one is very specific to the department. It's your preference that the department play a key role in coordinating these federal agencies that are here today.
I think it was beyond more than just a key role. I think I asked you to be the coordinating agency.
The key role, the coordinating agency. It's a question that I will take back to the department, and you're looking for a response very soon, if not by the end of the week. The second was a general question for all of the federal agencies represented here today. What's holding us back? And what, from a statutory perspective, what are the limitations that we face? And do we have any thoughts or suggestions on things that might help better facilitate our ability to make more rapid progress on this very serious problem that's facing all of us? So those are the two that I wrote down. I'll ask Erica if she has any additional takeaways that we'd like to bring back with us.
I would just add a commitment to consulting with the tribes, the ANCs, other Alaska Native entities, and with the Alaska Department of Conservation in our efforts moving forward.
And with the state.
Yeah, I think I said the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. That's what I meant.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. So for us, I see that we want to go back and find out what are the restrictions that we have and limitations and barriers that we can get your help with and the help of your fellow senators and others to remove that would keep us from being even more effective in helping to address contaminated lands. That's the key takeaway. But I should say that I'm additionally kind of energized by the conversation we've had and hearing from our partners across this dais and looking for ways that we can lean in further and more effectively in getting cleanups done expeditiously while we continue to work toward building and developing this database.
From the DOD side.
Senator, again, thank you for having us here today. In addition to our robust execution of the formerly used Defense Sites program, in FY22, we are going to spend about $45 million in the state of Alaska alone, as well as our execution of the NALEP program. We have taken back that we are going to research a more thorough answer to you on the restrictions for cleanup of active war sites specific to this community, but more broadly throughout our Alaska Native lands. And then specific considerations potentially for Anxia considerations in our prioritization protocols, and then anything else that may be holding us back from a statutory limitation. Colonel De La Rosa, did I miss anything?
No, ma'am, I think you got everything. I guess what I would tell you, ma'am, obviously, if Army doesn't show up for participation awards, I'm very proud of the fact that we have cleaned up 65% of the known FUD sites here in the state of Alaska. We've passed $1 billion, and as we said before, looking at about $1.65 billion to clean up the remainder of it. So very, very proud of this team that is here in the communities, and I take your point on consultation very seriously. I spend probably about 200 days of my year out in the communities here of Alaska, and I'm very proud of the teams that I have with me that know these folks on a by-name basis, and so we take that back with us as well.
I know you can't necessarily speak to it, but I believe if I ask you the question, do you think that we appropriately or adequately fund the Native American Lands Environmental Mitigation Program? Does that line item get sufficient funds given the need?
I believe that the present budget accurately reflects the requirements of the NALEP program, Senator.
Colonel De La Rosa, do you think that you have enough here in Alaska for the projects that you have?
Ma'am, I believe we do. I think what the challenge is The challenge is we know there's a lot of work to be done. So we also have to be realistic in what is the capacity of industry to accomplish what we're trying to do. So what we're being funded annually, which as Ms. Beasley has said, is more than any other state in the United States. We are executing it, and we are pushing industry to its extent. And so I think we're currently funded adequately annually at this point.
Okay. And maybe I framed it wrong. Maybe it's not, is the budget adequate? Do we have the resources? You know, we've got not only Unalaska Corporation that has its own environmental team. I know that many of our 8As are forming these. We're trying to build the capacity to do the projects that are required. And so maybe we haven't built sufficient capacity. In other words, we could be cleaning up more if we had greater ability to do so. Are those some limitations that nobody's really talked about today?
I think the answer is yes now. I mean, having more capacity obviously means the ability to do more work. But at the same time, which also then feeds my need for a larger staff to maintain. So they do go together to get after what you're asking for. We do have a very competitive. We do follow competitive contracting rules, and we do a lot of work with our 8As, whether through 8A set-asides or sole source. As I stated earlier, Unalaska Environmental Services is already doing 7 projects actively right now for underground storage tank removal here on Unalaska. So I think there is room for growth if industry grows with it. But we are on the ragged edge of probably pushing what industry can do, given our current funding.
Commissioner Bruni, takeaways for the state.
Thank you, Senator. My takeaway from this hearing is that we need to continue to hold the Department of Interior's feet to the fire. We need to continue our litigation. The fact that they could not make a commitment on the spot, knowing today that question would have been asked, is kind of face palm. It was amazing to me. But that said, Senator, I'm committed to working with our federal partners. Again, I am excited that Carlton has made this a priority. Administrations change, though. We need to ensure, though, that whatever ends up coming as a settlement is enforceable. I'm committed to working with our federal partners on databases, on understanding orphan sites. Orphan sites is such a misnomer. They're not orphan sites. The federal government is the responsible party. Orphan sites, that title normally is given to when you don't know who the responsible party is. Federal government owned the lands when they were contaminated. They're not orphan sites, but we are committed to working with them to give them suggestions for what work needs to be done on these sites. I've worked with your team, Senator, in the Appropriations Committee to give recommendations for earmarks or congressionally directed funding for what needs to be done to delineate the extent of the contamination. But these should not be congressional directed funding. These should be in the base budget of these agencies because it is their responsibility. Another takeaway, I'm committed to providing with you and with our federal partners legislative ideas that will help resolve this issue so they can't point to reasons in statute that why they can't do things. I'm committed to working with the Corps of Engineers. As I said previously, 3 years ago, I met with the Corps in D.C. With my suggestion for mitigation options. I've given that suggestion as well to Dave Hobby and to Sarah and to Colonel De La Rosa. Alaska has 175 million acres of wetlands, more wetlands than the lower 48 combined, yet when projects happen in this state, they want us to create more, or we also have more conservation system units in the lower 48, so 175 million acres of CSUs, more wilderness than the lower 48 combined. It is a no-brainer that we should be providing alternatives in working with the Corps of Engineers for mitigation opportunities, to clean up watersheds, to use the private sector and their funding and their desires to, from an ESG perspective as well as from a doing what's right for the watershed, to change the law so that 404 mitigation opportunities to clean up Anxia-contaminated lands, as Hallie brought up, is an option. And a final takeaway is I'm committed to working with Anvica and the affected folks to identify the sites that I know have not yet been put on one of these lists. There are sites, because the fear was there, Senator, that they would be responsible. We need to get an education campaign out there to make sure the village corporations, the regional corporations, know that the contamination that occurred before they owned these lands is not their responsibility. So, in conclusion, I'm committed to working, but I'm not committed to being the lead entity. That entity, the responsibility falls on the U.S. government.
Okay. Mayor. Actionable items.
I want to thank everyone that attended this hearing and from different federal agencies. I know it sounds easy for me to say, work together, get it done. I know you have a process. Every department has different goals, different, maybe even different agendas at sometimes, but you're affecting a community, small community of alley people, and it is a big picture of that whole thing. It is a community that's 5,000 to 6,000, and sometimes 9,000 to 12,000. And we have gone through so many times this process, this kind of hearing is a first for me, but I've testified on behalf of the Nungan people in regards to repatriation. When our people were taken from 6 other communities besides Unalaska from their homes. So I understand there's a lot of issues, but we have to clean this up, and our people are getting sick. And a lot of them have died in the last 45, 50 years. Some my age I grew up with. I know at least 3 of them died of cancer, from various degrees of cancer. And that's kind of alarming that that's happening. And I think a lot of it has to do with the contamination that was left here by the military, by the U.S. government. Some of these sites I mentioned are in other villages, not necessarily done by military, but they're done by U.S. governments, like FAA and White Owl stations that were put up many years ago after the war. Some of that's been cleaned up, but a lot of it hasn't been, and only because they didn't have enough funding. Cost to put people out on these sites is 4 to 5 times more than if you were doing it in downtown Anchorage or Juneau or these other places where tens of thousands of people live. We need to understand that it is costly. We know that. But at least try and clean up the lands that are economically viable for putting back into the community. We're afraid to do that without being accused of giving up property for homes and schools and things like that down the future, and then being told it's contaminated and not having the resources to work to get it done, get it cleaned up. So work with the corporation, work with the city, and work with the village. Find the areas that have priorities for this community and work from there out. If we go way out there, 20, 30 miles out there, and start cleaning up, I think it'd be good for OC, but nobody else is going to be there to enjoy it. In other words, downtown in Mackinac or the island of Mackinac, downtown on Alaska is still contaminated. Some of these houses are sitting on lands that were never cleaned. Every time the city or GCI, who's been here for almost 6 to 8 months now, they're finding stuff. And they have to stop and go to another location until it's been cleaned or remediated or reported, follow the process. It's costing them another millions of dollars just to put that cable in. And this is a cost that I don't know who's going to pay to that company. So work with us, and we'll do all we can to support you as industry, similar to what companies that we have in this community. Thank you, Senator, for what you do.
Thank you, Mayor. Holly, you get the last word.
All right. I just kind of want to reiterate that the leaders of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, Major Tudy Coffey, one of them, are very much alive today, signed that document, with the promise of economic prosperity and self-determination. Instead, we've largely been unable to develop these simple projects, and that equates to losses over a 50-year period that far outweigh the money then lands that we received. To be clear, we do not view receipt of contaminated lands as just compensation. Likewise, we do not believe continuing to write reports will result in the situation being resolved. So we've already talked about swapping the undesirable lengths of lands with unencumbered federal property, prioritizing the cleanup of Anxia-contaminated lands in the existing floods program. Just one comment on this that I want to highlight is I heard you say, the relative risk analyzing that you do in terms of, which sites to prioritize first. I used to do risk analysis at BP when I worked there. One of the top things that goes into the risk analysis is the number of people impacted by the contamination. And when you're looking at little tiny communities and a larger picture of the United States in general, all that money is going to be funneled into population centers that don't include villages. And so that's where we're hugely disconnected. Right there we get kicked out. And so, we just have to have some kind of a rural plus-up or something in the risk analysis of how you're doing that. How many years have gone by that the site has been sitting there? We've got technology out there that can analyze how the contamination is going to spread. We'd like to see some of that being done. We need to complete the Anxia-Contaminated Site database. We agree with you. We look forward to working with you, and we're excited about getting some funding to do that, to finally get a database that talks to each other, that is comprehensive, that talks about which sites are in various stages of cleanup and which ones have been qualified as done when we don't consider them done. Institutional control is not good enough. And if that's what it is, we can't clean it up, we need new land. We need to include ANC lands in EPA Travel Cleanup Super Fund, or create a $1 billion Alaska-specific cleanup fund. And if you're right, sir, we'll be done in 1 year. Adopt mitigation credits, like we've talked about already, require a minimum, you guys like writing reports, let's do that biannually. Let's just automatically write that report every other year to give an update on where these cleanups are. So then we don't have to come for 5 years just to result in this other thing that we've already done. And require, we need to provide the contractor preference that these folks have talked about. A lot of times folks are showing up in the villages and they start doing cleanup projects, and the city and the village corporation are going, what's going on? They've been given no opportunity to participate in the sole source or whatever, even if it's a competitive bid. These guys know the logistics, and I'm sure they'd be competitive if they were able to bid on the project to do the cleanup. And so, I think the biggest takeaway I have is, after listening to everything that's been done, we're clearly not on the same page in terms of the cost. So getting that database done, getting the analysis done, will get us to that point, and I'm looking forward to working on tweaking anything and providing some more suggestions to you on changes to the actual law that are holding us back. We've watched the Tribal Superfund cleanup as a great example where the United States has said, oh, we only do reservation cleanups. Well, that just means you're only going to do your stuff, okay? And you're not responsible for private lands. This was Congress's design to make it private, so that we could be the owners of our own destiny. That's what self-determination is. And now it's like, oh, no, that's not our problem, that's your problem, and that's just not good enough. So I think that's all the comments I have, and I just want to say thank you one more time for allowing us to be here today and talk about such an important issue to our people.
Well, thank you, Holly. Thank you all. I appreciate your contributions to the discussions, and I think there have been some very good and constructive takeaways that can be done at the department, the agency level, certainly at the legislative level, whether it's appropriations. We'll be looking critically at some of these accounts, but also, do we need to give more specific directive in statute? So to your point, Commissioner, it doesn't, the enthusiasm for what we're doing doesn't wane, or the commitment to doing something doesn't disappear, that we've actually got statutory enforcement. But then if it's statutory enforcement, then we need the department to do what the law says that it does, and that's where I think BLM has specifically failed in that. But I do think that there are some positive things that can be done now, and I want to encourage all of us that while greater information gathering is coming together, whether it's identifying those areas that have not yet been identified for a host of different reasons, identifying costs, determining this more fulsome inventory that does cross all of departments and agencies here, that we make sure that we're not halting the cleanup that is moving forward already. I appreciate what Department of Defense has shared in terms of ensuring that Alaska is seeing significant resources that are coming for that. We want to encourage that, but we want to see more of that, and I think how that all works concurrently rather than kind of chronologically is going to be important. I am just reminded that it was just a matter of weeks ago that in the Congress we passed pretty substantial legislation to recognize the reality that our government actions sometimes have consequences that are costly. And all you need to do is look to our national security, what we ask of our men and women who will don the uniform, volunteer to serve, and then who go overseas to other areas and they're exposed to toxic chemicals. We see the consequence of being in that environment. It may or may not be in a war environment, but whether it is exposure to things like Agent Orange or the burn pits that you see in Afghanistan, in Iraq. It's expensive. It's expensive to make sure that those veterans who come back and then test positive for cancer or disease or just the health consequences that they bear, we look at that and we say, well, that's expensive. That's expensive. But you know what? We should have thought about that before we expose them to these situations where their health is compromised for perhaps the rest of their life. They may die because of this exposure. And so we can talk about how much this is going to cost, but I think we need to recognize that the cost to the environment, we gotta fix it. The cost when it comes to human life and people that pass with cancer, those who have been exposed, again, unwittingly. You think that you can eat from the land and from the ocean, only to find out that you have been exposed to toxins that have been sitting there for decades. through no fault of your own. It's not like you needed to go out and research this. You're living in a land that we thought was pretty special, and it is pretty special. And we've got an obligation to clean up the messes that we create. And sometimes we just have to acknowledge that it's going to cost money. But we don't walk away from it, particularly when it is our government that has caused the problem, the environmental degradation and just devastation, and then the human consequence and the loss of life. So we got some work to do. And we can't let this be another hearing where we check back in later and we get another report. We've got action items that need to move forward on. We've got a lot of different ways that we can be working together, but we cannot continue to say it's somebody else's responsibility. So let's figure this out, and know that I'm going to be looking for some feedback very shortly from some of you, and I think we will figure out a way that we can reconvene to get status reports, because I think we've got some deliverables to the people of Alaska. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we stand adjourned. Thank you. Oh, wait. I was supposed to say the committee record is going to be held open for another 2 weeks, right? I'm looking to my I guess whatever that voice just said, we'll just believe her. Those that are interested, a recording of this hearing today is going to be posted on the committee's website, so just for your information there. And again, to those who were either listening or who are here, know that you too are welcome to submit your comments. So appreciate that. Now we're officially adjourned. Thank you all. Thank you. That was good. Thank you, everyone.